So good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I think we can now get started. Today's webinar, produced by Inside ARM and brought to you by Ontario Systems, focuses on Ontario Systems Cost of Compliance Survey highlights, including panelist perspectives on real-world strategies and implications. I'm joined on today's webinar by a really impressive panel. So at the top, we have Rozanne Andersen, who currently serves as Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at Ontario Systems. Her 28+ years of experience as General Counsel, Chief Lobbyist, Executive Vice President, and CEO of ACA International, as well as a practicing attorney specializing in banking and financial services, have made Rozanne one of the most respected experts in the industry. Known as a frequent presenter and consultant on all CFPB-related compliance topics, Rozanne brings perspectives from both legal and tech to the ARM and healthcare industry's most serious compliance challenges. CJ Clingler is part of the Ontario Systems compliance team. In this role, she works with the team on client engagements and assists with the development and delivery of CFPB readiness products and services. She provides the team with industry-specific data analysis regarding compliance and compliance management issues. Amy Kennedy has been an integral part of Ontario Systems for more than 25 years, maintaining key roles in product development and management. Her deep understanding of the business processes and accounts receivable market has enabled her to design and direct enhancements and product solutions for many of Ontario Systems products. As a Senior Director, Product Management, Amy works with others to balance the product portfolio and advance a connected solution for the product families to address market needs. Nicole Perkins serves as the Chief Risk Officer for Client Services, Inc. She has been part of the ARM industry for 19 years, and more than 17 of those with CSI. Nikki has assisted with developing and overseeing several of the company's departments, including bookkeeping, consumer advocacy, internal audit, licensing, as well as incoming and outgoing correspondence. Rodney Meeks is the President and CEO of Credit Consulting Services, Inc. in Salinas, California. He is a second generation of a family-owned business who began his career in the collection industry in 1985. Rodney is active at both the state and national level in the collection industry. He has served as Unit President for the California Association of Collectors and currently serves on Unit and State Affairs Committees for the ACA International. He also currently serves on the Board of Directors for the Salinas Rotary Club and Salinas Valley Chamber of Commerce. John Bedard is the Managing Attorney of Bedard Law Group, PC, located in Atlanta, Georgia. John represents creditors, asset buyers, and debt collectors, helping them stay in compliance with state and federal law. He also manages the nationwide litigation for several collection agencies and focuses his litigation practice on FDCPA, TCPA, and FCRA defense. And finally, hi, I am Mike Bevel, Director of Education for the Compliance Professionals Forum and the IA Institute, as well as an editor at Inside ARM. I have just a couple pieces of housekeeping to go through. The first is, and listen to this part, this webinar is being recorded. Ontario Systems will be sending out the slide deck and the playback of this webinar within a couple of weeks of today's presentation, but do keep in mind we've got Thanksgiving coming next week, so you should really look for materials around the first week of December. All of your microphones have been muted, but we can still hear you via the chat function. You can send your questions, comments, reactions, etc. via that, and we will handle them accordingly. We have a Q&A planned for the end of today's presentation. Speaking of the end of today's presentation, there is a survey, a satisfaction survey. We want to make sure that the information we're putting out to you is information that is useful and educational and all of that. So do take a moment, because it just helps all of us be better educators to you. The final bit of housekeeping is some legalese that I will read through on the record. This information is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to make sure that this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area, however, nor should it be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. So After all of that is now out of the way, I think we can jump right into it. I'm going to turn things over to CJ Clingler, who will get us started. So CJ, I've got the agenda slide up, and it's yours to go.
All right, thank you, Mike. And hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. Before we get started, I'm going to give a brief overview of what you can expect during today's presentation. So first, I will be taking you all through the highlights from our cost of compliance survey. Rozanne Andersen will then lead a panelist discussion with Nicole Perkins and Rodney Meeks to get their perspectives on the cost of compliance. John Bedard and Amy Kennedy will then provide some insight to using technology to multiply compliance effectiveness. And finally, Rozanne and John will wrap things up with thoughts regarding the election results and what it means for our industry. All right, we can go ahead and get started, Mike. Before we get into the actual survey results, I want to give a brief backdrop to the survey and how it all came together. So we started out with a few different goals for this study. The first was to provide benchmarking data to the industry with regards to compliance. The second was to benchmark the cost of compliance for larger market participants in the ARM industry. And the third was to identify potential correlations between agencies' compliance initiatives and the incidence of consumer complaints and lawsuits. Next slide. So the cost of compliance survey is the first of its kind conducted by Ontario System. It's intended to be used as a resource for debt collection agencies as they evaluate their compliance management systems. And for this first survey we conducted, we partnered with the Ball State University Center for Business and Economic Research, where we coordinated with Drs. Michael Hicks and Jennifer Bott in an effort to keep responses anonymous. So the Ball State team delivered the surveys to the LMPs that we selected to participate. They collected their responses and then de-identified those responses before sending the final collection of data back to us for analysis. And this initiative was and still is being led by our compliance consulting team, and it's managed by both Rozanne Andersen and myself. The survey was launched in August of 2015. 45 larger market participants were selected to receive the survey, and each question had at least a 50% response rate. Next slide, please. All right, let's take a quick look at the participants' demographics. We surveyed only larger market participants, and we wanted to determine how much variation there was between the agencies that responded. So we looked at both annual revenue and the number of collectors at each agency. And as you can see by the graph on the left, a majority of respondents received over $25 million in annual revenue. And then when it comes to the number of collectors shown by the graph on the right, it was a pretty even split between the 4 different response categories, but there were about 64% of respondents who fell right in the middle of the road between the 100 and 500 collector range. So next slide, please. All right, and we can jump right into the survey results here. So one of the first things that we asked the LMPs was whether they had line items in their budgets for certain compliance expenditures. You can see here we specifically called out licensing fees, corporate certifications, compliance continuing education, annual compliance audits, training and testing personnel, and compliance personnel. And every single one of these areas is considered important enough to be called out and tracked in the budget, as you can see by the responses. The area where even the fewest number of LMPs said they had a budget for it is annual compliance audits, and it still has a majority of 59% of the LMPs budgeting for this expense. And we're actually going to talk more about audits, compliance audits specifically later on. So next slide, please. So we can clearly see from the results that LMPs are investing heavily in compliance in at least these 6 specific categories. It's imperative in today's market to be investing, tracking, and documenting the results of your compliance activities, which we'll hear more about from our panelist discussion later on. Next slide. The next area we looked at were the average number of complaints these agencies receive each year. There are 3 different channels of that a consumer might complain through, and we asked about all 3. So the first is third-party complaints, which can come from the Better Business Bureau, the State Attorney General, or the CFPB themselves. The second is complaints the consumer might send in writing. And the third is verbal complaints an agency receives over the phone or in person. And I want to draw attention to the far right of this slide, which indicates receipt of over 500 complaints annually. 40% of the agencies said they receive over 500 verbal complaints each year. And if we move on to the next slide, this is really significant because while the FDCPA only requires agencies to track and respond to written complaints and disputes, you have to also be tracking verbal complaints to get the whole picture. And the LMPs who responded to this survey have clearly adapted to the CFPB's expectations that they respond to both the written and verbal complaint, and they're getting that full picture then by tracking all of those. So let's move on to the next slide. Here we have the average number of FDCPA disputes the agencies receive per year. There wasn't a lot of variation in the responses to this question, and 12% of participants skipped it actually, but you can still take a look and see where your agency might fall on this scale and how it stacks up to the LMPs who did respond. And if we move on to the next slide. This is also an important area to be aware of at your agency because analysis of your FDCPA disputes is essential to uncovering the root cause of them. They need to be logged, examined, and reported to the highest governing body at your agency on a regular basis so that compliance can continually be driven from the top down. And once that root cause is uncovered and reported, it's that highest governing body's responsibility to direct resolution of the issue, drive remediation, and ultimately confirm that necessary organizational changes have been made. Next slide. So this chart is the average number of eOscars and direct disputes received by the agencies per year. You can see that direct disputes were mostly on the low end of the scale, with 44% of agencies receiving less than 1,000 direct disputes. And eOscars, on the other hand, seem to be at both extremes. So 32% of agencies also had less than 1,000 eOscars, but on the other hand, 32% also had over 10,000. And it's not really clear from this particular study what could cause such a large split towards the extremes in that area, so it could be worth following up on in the future. Next slide. What we can take away here is the heavy emphasis the CFPB has placed on credit reporting practices in recent years. There have been 4 guidance bulletins regarding disputes under the FCRA since April of 2012. The risks, liability, and costs associated with credit reporting are driving agencies out of the business altogether. So you want to be careful and watch the disputes that you have coming in and be tracking those issues. Next slide, please. So moving on to the area of collection litigation, we first asked the LMPs whether they had an in-house legal department. And as you can see from the graph, 68% of respondents said they do, while 32% do not. Next slide. So we asked here how much agencies spent in the last 12 months on legal defense. We had some mixed results, but we're pleasantly surprised to see the majority of LMPs surveyed seem to have had relatively low legal defense expenses in that 12-month time frame. 57% indicated they spent less than $250,000, but there was a 17% pocket of agencies who said they spent over $750,000. So let's move on to the next slide. Preliminary findings suggest the impact of compliance behavior on legal defense costs has been positive and dramatic. As I said before, we were pleasantly surprised by the responses we got, as we had expected to see much higher dollar amounts in this area. But the thing to remember here is that the costs of defense are not a cost of doing business, and they can be avoidable. And I would like to reach out to Rozanne for some comments here, since this was such a surprising result to us. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
The only thing I would like to add, CJ, is the fact that if certain types of compliance behaviors actually correspond to reduced defense costs, it really makes a compelling argument with or without the presence of the CFPB as we know it to be today. So what we are hoping to do with our 2017 survey is to really dig down into this particular data point to determine, if this holds, if it holds for the next, for 2016 and 17 in terms of compliance and its correlation to lower defense costs. And for those who are listening, defense costs, I mean, not to sound too basic, but we're going to get into legal damages in a second. So what we're talking about are the costs you really incur to pay for the defense of a lawsuit. CJ?
All right. Thanks, Rozanne. We can go on to the next slide, like Rozanne said, to legal damages. And here, this graph shows the damages paid out by the agencies in the last year, again, that 12-month time frame. And we were surprised again to see this kind of response to the question because all respondents said they paid less than $1 million in damages in that 12-month time frame, with 87% of them actually paying less than half of that. There were other larger dollar amount options to choose from for this question, and no one responded with those. So that $1 million was the cap that we saw when agencies were responding to this survey in that August and September timeframe of 2015. So these were really astounding results, as traditionally we would have seen responses in the $1.5 to $5.5 million range as opposed to just the $1 million range. And there's two possibilities for this drastic of a difference in what we expected. And the first is that perhaps only those experiencing success chose to answer this question. But the second is that the expansion of the LMP's compliance teams and their focus on compliance may be having a positive impact on their business. And so you might ask the question, well, what areas of compliance are they focusing on to have that kind of an impact? And that's where we're going to get into the key takeaways from this survey. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we had three main goals in mind for the survey, one of which was to identify potential correlations between compliance initiatives and low litigation and complaint numbers. And when we analyzed the data from that perspective, we discovered three solid compliance trends between the LMPs with the lowest numbers of complaints and litigation. And those three areas were their compliance, their training practices, their dedication to compliance personnel, and their annual compliance audit process. Next slide. So the first area we're going to look at is training. And these agencies all had the following in common. So they all had a dedicated trainer. Their new hire collectors spend 60 hours or more on initial training. There is a line item in their budget specifically for training resources. And they cover a wide variety of compliance-related topics during their training program. And you can see that variety. I mean, it goes everything from the FDCPA to UDAP and ECOA to HIPAA if that's required for them. Next slide. So just some brief commentary around these points. First, these LMPs are clearly investing financially in their training program by having a dedicated trainer and including training resources in their budget. And beyond that, training hours themselves are considered a wise investment as well, And that's demonstrated in these agencies' commitment to ensure their collectors know what they're doing and how to comply with the consumer financial protection laws. So their collectors are not advanced to the floor until they've passed several exams covering those topics we saw on the previous slide, and completing mock exercises under the supervision of highly experienced trainers. So agencies who limit their, yes.
Hi, CJ, sorry, this is Rozanne. I just wanted to make one comment here about this training business. You know, for many of us who have been in the industry for, let's say, more than 5 years and maybe 20 or 25 years, we know that training, let's say 10 years ago, meant FDCPA, maybe FCRA training, but for certainly FDCPA training was popular. I just wanted to underscore the fact that with these larger market participants, they are training across about, about 11 or 12 disciplines. So it is, and when we use the word training in the survey, we were not interested in operational training, how to use their systems. It was purely focused on compliance with consumer financial law. I just wanted to add that. Thank you, CJ.
Yep, perfect. No, thank you, Rozanne. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. The LMPs with low litigation and complaint numbers also showed that they are focused on compliance by having dedicated compliance personnel. They have a chief compliance officer or a compliance manager or some other similar position who has direct access to the board of directors or whatever their highest governing body is. They have a formal compliance committee in place, and they also budget specifically for their compliance personnel. And the impact that this has had on the industry is we've seen an increased demand for compliance personnel, and salaries for these individuals is increasing as a result of that. But the cost ratio decreases with the size of your agency. So if you have a smaller agency, you don't have to scramble to find $100,000 or more in your budget for a chief compliance officer, when you really might only need a compliance manager to handle the day-to-day compliance department tasks. But you do want to make sure that that individual in that role has the support they need from the rest of your leadership team and that direct access to your executive. Next slide. The final thing that these agencies had in common was their annual audit process. These LMPs are investing time, money, and resources into auditing their compliance with consumer financial laws on a regular basis, both internally and externally. While it's important to conduct your own internal audits, it's also imperative that you have a third party come in and assess your agency's compliance policies and procedures. So you need that check and balance to be sure you're covering any gaps in your compliance management system, because you don't know what it is that you don't know. But conducting that regular external compliance audit with a third party is going to expose that and put you back on the right track. So with these key takeaways from the survey in mind, we're going to transition over to Rozanne and the panelists to get their thoughts and perspectives on the cost of compliance.
Thank you, CJ. Thank you very much. Yes, as we transition to more of an interactive dialogue with Nikki and Rodney, I want to just set this up as follows. The reason we decided to only examine larger market participants in this particular survey is because we were seeking to find the most consistent or similarly organized companies as we possibly could. I think many of you know there is a tremendous disparity in the size of agencies in the collection industry, the market segment they focus on, etc. And we just wanted to be sure that we were clearly comparing apples to apples as much as we possibly could. In the future, we plan to break this down and survey topics such as the cost of compliance based more on market segments as well as size of the agency. But for now, we are really looking at how have the larger market participants evolved. So with that, we are going to begin with a few questions here. And the first one is, for our panelists, when it comes to compliance with consumer financial laws, has your organization added compliance as a line item to your annual budget? I'll begin with Nikki on this one, and then we'll move to Rodney.
Short answer, yes, absolutely.
Rodney?
The short answer is no. So we're a size of 26 employees with 13 collectors. I have, however, you start submitting claims to errors and admissions, and you want to keep that separate from your legal fees that you're spending on filing suit against consumers, and so we have carved that piece out.
Excellent. It's not unusual for many agencies at this point to not have a specific line item for compliance. And in a second, we're going to talk about what Nikki may be recommending as items to track. But the reason I find it to be a compelling data point with regard to the compliance budget is that I don't know how this has been drilled into my head, but if you cannot, you really, in order to know if you're doing well at something, you need to be able to measure it. And so in order to know, if you're doing well, if you're doing poorly, or how your performance compares to compliance, you have to at least measure compliance. So Nikki, what types of expenditures do you find valuable to track?
Well, I was really encouraged to see that the survey was along the same lines of what I was thinking. We find it valuable to track all of the same top 6 areas that have been outlined here. Another area that I think is important to mention is tracking the programming and the software needs, especially for an LMP. We typically have software that assists us with keeping compliant, maintaining our compliance, and monitoring our compliance. So that does end up turning into a expenditure line item.
Thank you, thank you. I know that other items that people track oftentimes would be education, outside training, convention attendance and participation, whether it's speech analytics, all sorts of software and tools that may be used. But as we expand the use of tools and expand compliance generally, so too will the line item likely increase over time. So what we're hoping is that by appreciating the fact that training, a compliance department, and an annual audit, those 3 data points have been elevated as the contributors to success, so to speak, that we are hoping to help the industry identify where it should focus its resources. Next slide, please. I believe it's an audience poll. This poll asks, how much do you spend annually on training and training personnel? The responses are anonymous. We are not we are seeking only some general responses here to get a feel for how our attendees are performing in this area. Mike, I'm not sure if you have any instructions for folks when they, with regard to the poll, but if not, just let me know when it's...
They're doing it. They've got
okay.
This one, Rozanne. They're just clicking
okay. All right.
I'm going to give it a couple more seconds because responses are still coming in. But while we're waiting, Rozanne, if you had to guess, where do you think most responders are?
Oh, I would say most agencies would be in the, I would have to say between one of the first two, 0 to 75 or 75 to 150 would be my guess.
So I'm going to share the results, and you're a little right, but also, interestingly, what got the most is most people aren't sure how that cost is being tracked. But then those who are sure falls into that first bucket that you thought, which is 0 to 75K.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm going to hide the poll results for the moment, and we can go back to the presentation proper.
All right. Well, hopefully those of you who are not tracking training may feel a bit more compelled to take a look at it after this webinar, just so that you have that metric to compare year to year. Let's take a look now at the influence of the CFPB on our panelists. Describe, Rodney, I'll go with you first. Describe how your training programs have changed in the past several years since the CFPB really came on the scene and began to supervise the collection industry.
Well, you know, our training programs have always been pretty intense. I'm looking at the survey with, you know, at least 60 hours invested in training new hires. We've always invested at least 60 hours into new hires because there's so much to cover. As a matter of fact, I can remember when HSBC used to have a call center in our own backyard, and we would hire former employees of HSBC, and they told us that our training program was much more elaborate than a big credit card company's. So, but I will say that with all the rules and regulations, that it is far more in depth. And as we have gone through some succession planning with some long-term employees, we had a long-term trainer, and determining who is going to handle that role going forward. We need to make sure that that person was fully committed and understood the importance of the whole compliance piece. So we're much more focused in that area now.
Excellent. Nikki?
I would say, like Rodney, we've definitely increased our training. We've added training staff. We have a longer training program now and different metrics that the agents need to meet in order to graduate to the next step of the training program. We have more defined training modules that are geared towards all of the different specific regulations, and we get into more detail about the specific regulations. And the CFPB has made it more important to start tracking our training in a better manner. So we've got some systemic tracking to ensure that the agents are completing their training and the notifications to ensure that the managers are making their agents complete the training. So we do a lot of analyzing of the effectiveness of our training to make sure, you know, not every single agent learns the same way. So make sure we're still meeting the needs of all of our agents in order to help educate them to move along.
Rozanne,
yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add that too, and like Nikki was saying, you know, we log all of our training now where we didn't used to log all of the training. So aside from the initial training program, you know, all of the additional training that takes place afterwards with the tenured employees, that's all logged.
That's great. One thing I was wondering, and this is very anecdotal, our new hires, have you noticed they're somewhat just taken aback by the complexity of the collection industry? Nikki, do you see that at all, that with new hires and they begin to see what the kind of training they're going to go through, they basically turn and walk the other way? Any of that happen at all?
We do see them surprised based on the persona that they've been able to get from the industry as a whole. But they are surprised that we're geared more towards customer service and we're heavily regulated. But we try to cover a lot of that during the interview process, so there's not such shock and awe when they actually sit down in a seat.
Okay, all right. Rodney, is that pretty much the same for you too?
Yeah, that's pretty much the same. And we've been hiring. We have a state university in our backyard, and we've been hiring from the state university, and the students they're surprised. And I say anybody that's new to the collection industry is really surprised into the detail and the regulation that goes in, and just the professionalism that goes into everything that we do.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go to the next slide, Mike. So with regard to new hires, and let's get into some specifics if you don't mind, what kind of courses would you, or what do you, like, are they in training, the new hires, for example, are they in training for 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks? or do you have any perspective on what you've seen out in the industry, what people are doing? Nikki, do you want to go first? And we'll go to Rodney.
Sure. We've got, we like to do a lot more classroom training during the first week. However, we will incorporate listening to some phone calls. We give them examples of good phone calls and things that we want, examples of how to achieve following these rules with live phone calls or recorded phone calls. We find that that's very valuable. We focus a lot on the regulatory during week 1 and week 2. And they have to actually achieve a certain score on their initial training and their testing in order to become certified to be able to actually dial a phone call. And even then, they're dialing with supervision during a certain period of time after that.
Okay. How about for you, Rodney?
Yeah, we have a solid, I would say a solid week to a week and a half of classroom training, followed by shadowing, and then there's also testing as well. So they're required to have a passing grade through the testing. So it's constantly monitored. They do shadowing after that, and then we'll do role playing. And so we go through a whole role playing process as well before they actually make the call. And I think, with the advancement of technology, the job skills and requirements, there's a lot of multitasking. There's a lot of things going on at one time. It can be really overwhelming. So you're asking a new hire to process a lot of information. And so it takes a while for them to get up to speed, and everybody processes differently. And so that's part of the evaluation process. And we go through a 90-day introductory period. We're checking in to make sure that they are retaining their processing and retaining the information that we're providing them with.
Yeah, I think that retention of information is difficult for the adult learner in any environment, and regardless of age, particularly when it's highly technical as it is in the collection industry. So I can imagine that, going back, identifying where the weak areas are, I mean, that's got to be very, very important. Let's start with Rodney. I know you have a smaller collection agency environment, but how do you update, let's say, the senior management of your organization to make sure that they are aware of CFPB expectations, even if it is for the smaller agency?
I usually email about 4:30 in the morning when I can't sleep. So I'm
like
getting
a true CEO. That's great.
Yeah. So when I'm getting these, when I wake up, I can't sleep, and I'm reading the daily news feeds, East Coast time, and as I'm on the West Coast, then I'm forwarding this information and chiming in with my senior management team, and they're asking me, why are you up?
Right. I get that completely. Nikki, do you have a program at all to update your board of directors, your senior leadership team?
We do. Actually, our direct ownership team actually takes the same training, ongoing training modules and tests that any bottom line employee would take. So they're all susceptible to the same updates there. But as far as new CFPB rules and anything that's happening in the industry with the regulatory matters, we have an executive compliance group that meets at least monthly, and we have a formal meeting. It includes ultimate ownership to make sure everyone that represents a certain facet within the company is made aware of what is going on in the industry.
Rozanne, I'd like to also add that I make the investment to bring my my top management team out to the annual conferences, and then make sure that they're getting credits to through the ACA and the Scholar program.
I think that's great, and you raise a very good point. One thing that we see out in the field is that agencies, I suppose you cannot do everything well all the time. It's like a lot of things in life, but there now seems to be a decent amount of focus on training the floor managers and your collection staff, but sometimes the senior executives are left behind and not given the opportunity to really get out there, free themselves of the collection environment pressure, so to speak, and actually absorb new information. So my personal commentary is that don't leave some of the senior people, some of the people who've been there the longest, don't leave them behind either, because it's through their vision and absorbing new information that they can probably take your company to the next level. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I would say as a smaller shop, I mean, the communication is probably easier just because, you know, we're looking at each other in the eye every day.
Right. Do you do largely healthcare, I would think? I think
Yep.
I know that. Yeah,
yep.
That's okay. All right, we have another audience poll. How many full-time equivalents do you have devoted to compliance? Please select one. You might say, how do we define compliance? Well, you're just going to have to, it could be anything from a compliance manager to a quality assurance person, but people that you believe, if the CFPB knocked on your door and said, have your FTEs devoted to compliance, come meet with us in the lobby, how many people would you pull out of your staff? Again, we're looking for just some raw estimates here.
All right, Rozanne, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot again. I'm going to ask you to guess. Where do you think, and looking at the results that you got from your own survey, where do you think most of the attendees today are going to fall?
I'm going to say 0 to 3.
If we were on a game show right now, Rozanne Andersen, I would be offering you some money because that's correct. We saw 54%
okay.
in that 0 to 3 area.
Great.
So, perfect. I'm going to hide these results, and you are back to your compliance department slide.
Thank you. So now we're going to take a look at the compliance department, because we learned that the first data point we gleaned from the survey was that training made a difference with regard to complaints and litigation. The next data point we identified was that compliance departments were contributed to a decrease in complaints and litigation against an agency. So Nikki, would you describe your compliance department, however you choose to define the term, and tell us if you have a compliance committee or an officer, whatever.
Sure. I would say in that poll, we definitely fell at the high end of that, the last bullet point for sure.
Okay.
We have a multifaceted compliance function. We have multiple compliance and risk officers. It also includes our QA call monitoring process. Our employees are responsible for that. Our audit team. We have a compliance committee that is also that we're responsible for making sure we're up to date on all the compliance rules and regulations that are going on, as well as the compliance matters that are happening within the company. We also have several subcommittees dedicated to specific focus areas. For example, complaints. Complaints is a big focus for the CFPB, and we need to make sure we're on top of what's going on with our complaints and monitoring our trending and making sure we're taking action if there's a trend noticed. So all of these different committees and personnel report their activities all the way up through executive leadership through that executive group that I talked about earlier.
All right. Do they look at, did you say that they, I think you did, but do they examine your complaints and look at trends? Does that committee do that?
They absolutely do.
Okay. Rodney, within your environment, how do you have any sort of a committee or smaller group that may focus on compliance?
Yep, so it would consist of myself, Vice President of Operations, Collection Floor Supervisor, and Quality Assurance Officer. And it's interesting, I can remember when we first created the position for quality assurance officer, and we're going through that generational change and over the company, and my dad saying, why are we taking a top collector and putting her as a quality assurance officer? I said, well, because she knows it best, and she's getting a little burnt out after over 25 years of collecting, so I think that she's best qualified. And he had a real hard time with it, but we saw that it really served its purpose.
See, that's interesting to me, and you note something that is also a factor with regard to compliance is many of you are likely part of a family-owned business. Your succession plan is either underway or no one wants to talk about one. In the larger market participant environment, that you may see pressures more from an outside investor group, you name it. But in any event, this focus on compliance has certainly increased over the past several years. So one thing I wanted to comment on for the listeners here, you can see that we've intentionally put together a representative from a larger market participant organization and a representative from a much smaller organization. Let's put it that way. I like to refer to them as boutique agencies, but that doesn't matter. My point is that regardless of your size, how do you tell your story when you're completing an RFP, when you're having your annual meeting with your client? How do you tell your story about compliance? If nothing else, if these questions that we've put here that we are posing to the panelists help you create a response, I think that is a tremendous equalizer between agencies large and small so that you can continue to effectively compete in the marketplace. Well,
Rozanne, the other thing is when we put the quality assurance officer in place, not only did it help us, make sure that we're staying compliant with the latest rules and regulations, but it actually increased our performance level too.
It did? Well, that's nice to hear. I bet Dad like that.
Anyway. It's making sure that, the things that you're teaching your collectors during training and your tenured people too, because, they get in their old habits, that they're applying what you're telling them to apply.
That's right. And I really shouldn't do this. I know, Mike, I will not bog this down, but we were in an agency recently, and sometimes when we do these assessments, we will pull collectors off the floor, not completely by surprise, but with the permission of management. Anyway, we are finding that some of these collectors, the tenured collectors, are saying, well, all the new collectors get all the new training, and they seem to be up to speed on everything, and we're kind of just, catch as catch can and kind of learn as we go. So it's interesting that you say your quality assurance person has really increased performance, because that really supports what we're seeing, that the more you train, the more you observe these various, comply with your own policies, the better it is in the end. So do you tie, Nikki, performance on call audits to collector and or floor manager compensation?
Absolutely. I'm a huge advocate for this. You have to be able to, you can't just sit and smile and dial. You have to actually be able to prove that you're compliant, and if not, we have to make sure that we validate that this is working. And when there's a lot of other agencies, lots of conversations I've had with other agencies about this, and everybody has their own secret method to do it. But at the end of the day, you're getting paid to do a job, and you need to be able to do your job effectively. And if you're not, then that salary needs to be impacted. I can tell you when we implemented it years ago, even before the CFPB was a factor, it immediately changed behavior, if we even had any behaviors that needed to be changed. But for those that needed to be buttoned up a little bit, they straightened right up. And it was the proof was in the results right there. And we know, based on recent litigation, and we know that this is important for the government. We know that the CFPB cares about this. So we have to make sure that we're driving compliant behavior, and really that's the most effective way to do it.
Great comment. Rodney?
We do not, but we are currently in the process of doing so. And matter of fact, this is one of our topics that I'm having with my benchmark group at the end of the month.
Interesting. That's great. That's great because, and that's another nice point I think for us to make at this time with our audience. Compliance is an evolution. You cannot dot all the I's and cross the T's today and think that you're done. It's an ongoing process, and really you just keep chipping away at the various issues as you move toward overall improvement with performance and with compliance performance in particular for this topic. All right, Mike, let's go to the next slide on assessments. The third data point that we learned had made a difference, and I think what this part of the study really told us that if you never stop and look at what you're doing to figure out if it's working, you've got a problem. So the question is, I'll go to Rodney, and we are not defining assessment for this conversation any more than we did really formalize the term for our survey participants. We really are looking at the process used to assess whether their policies and procedures, training and compliance programs were meeting CFPB expectations. So Rodney and or Nikki, it doesn't matter to me. We can start with Rodney if you like, but how do you assess whether your policies and procedures, training and compliance programs, if you're really firing on all cylinders in this regard? How do you do it?
So as we're meeting on a weekly basis when we go over our audits, and then we're, based upon our findings, and for the most part we see that they are working. And then for the few complaints that we get through the CFPB portal, and then also with the e-Oscars and the requests for validations that we get on a daily basis, we know that 99% of those things are false disputes. They're just people trying to get out of paying their debt, and they're not valid. Okay. And that's the great thing about having call recording, because you can go back and you can listen to those conversations to validate that.
Interesting. So you basically use some technology to help you examine how you're performing against your own quality assurance checklist, it sounds like.
Yeah, and so we'll listen to the call. We'll make sure that the documentation on the account is mirrors what the call was about, and so we do a full audit of that.
Nikki, I'd like to pose this question to you. I'd like you to comment how you assess, how do you respond to the question on the screen, but also adding to that is, how do you actually tie call audits to floor manager compensation, or do you? Let's start with the first.
Well, to speak with, let me answer the question. The question is on the screen first?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, we assess our entire CMS. Basically, most of it's through our internal audit program, but it really has to do, our internal audit program is reassessed at least annually. Our audit calendar is a living and breathing document, so as there's additional risk in certain areas, we will change the frequency of an audit or the scope or the sample size. So that's a main factor of it, but we also, the QA call monitoring, the complaint trending is a way that we can assess whether things are working and we're meeting expectations. But the level of external client auditing that we're susceptible to is also a way for us to measure. I mean, they're monitoring our performance just as much as we are. So it's good to, when we like to see their feedback and their results in order to help us supplement our testing. External risk assessments are always a good idea with this as well. But to your question, what was the other question again, Rozanne? I'm sorry.
It was about tying call audit results to floor managers and their compensation. Is there any way to do that?
Loosely, yes.
You may have mentioned it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, loosely, it's hard because, a manager can only be so responsible for what their agent is saying on the phone. But if it has to do with a training issue or an ongoing issue that the manager was responsible for helping them better understand, then yes, and then that situation can be tied to an manager's compensation. But if the agent is just, they've been given the proper direction, we have proof that they've received it, and they just did not follow the rules, then you can only hold the manager so responsible at that point.
Right. A couple of observations I would make for the person who posed the question. Number one, I mean, do what you will, but I would never recommend that a floor manager is auditing and evaluating his or her own team. Number one. If they do, that would be a part of the audit process, but certainly someone independent of the particular team should be auditing the team members for compliance with consumer financial laws. The other thing I'd like to offer, and I'm always sensitive to, the large market participants have financial resources to oftentimes have people in quality assurance who can listen to calls, analyze calls, and that have nothing to do with the floor at all. They're like ivory tower people almost. And but for those of you who are really not able to fund a extremely robust call auditing program with people, you can have collectors from one team basically audit collectors from another team. You can be creative, but you never want to have a situation where the fox is watching the hen house, because that's just not, it's not relevant information. You really want to try to bring some objectivity into your call audit process.
Rozanne, I know this.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Rodney.
Rozanne, I know this is kind of off the grid a little bit, but I guess this is a question for Nikki. What qualifies one of your quality assurance officers? Because obviously you want to make sure that they have experience within the collection industry, and I think that's the tough thing for a smaller boutique agency like myself, because you only have so many people to select from, as opposed to a large market participant like Nikki. She's got a team where she can promote from within, and that's not always that easy with a small market participant.
That's a good question, Rodney. We do have the ability to promote from within, which is great. But we just have a really structured set of requirements that they have to abide by. So really, it can be taught to anyone. Anyone who has the patience to sit and listen and can be analytical. But there's a very specific checklist for a phone call, and while there is so much subjectivity to it, we also are firm believers in a recalibration process. So, I mean, you've got humans listening to a phone call and scoring a phone call. Well, you have to have a recalibration process, because someone might disagree with them. So if someone's penalized, then they want to challenge the penalty, then we go through a separate recalibration with a different person, have them listen to it, have them score it themselves. So it basically gives it a second chance to have a second set of ears listen to it. But I think that's really helpful, regardless of who you hire. But it really is, as long as you have good rules and good checklists in place, they should be trainable. But I think some collection experience or some monitoring or some even auditing experience is helpful for these roles. I hope that answered your question.
Please.
That was great.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you.
And I think, one of the things that we struggle with at times is the whole subjective piece. And that really adds to the whole cost.
Absolutely.
It does. It does. I agree. We have a poll for our audience, whether you conduct an annual audit. Is it internal, external, or do you do at least one of each?
People appear to be busily clicking.
I'm going to say internal is the most popular answer.
I am interested. I'm going to just let this go a little bit longer. So there's one response, there's one reply that nobody has picked yet. And that's a little fast. Yeah, I made that noise too, but quietly, Rozanne, in my mind. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Yeah, so let's close and let's take a look. So no one is, external got 0%, sort of evenly split, but sort of closely matched between yes internal or yes both. But
Wow.
no sole external. Well,
that gives me pause. All right, yes, yes. All right, well, let's go to the next couple of slides. We want to turn this very quickly over to Amy and John. I'm going to ask Nikki and Rodney to give me a quick response to how often do you conduct an internal or an external compliance audit? Rodney?
So we do internal daily.
Okay. Okay, Nikki?
We conduct both. We are constantly performing internal audits with our audit team, and we've done a couple of external assessments as well.
Okay. All right, new rules, kind of up in the air right now with the election, etc. But for now, what I would like to ask is, how is your team responding to the outline of the new rules as presented by the CFPB? Nikki?
We basically started to scope how we would handle these new rules and adhere to them if it was passed as is. We've also thought of a few different variations on how we could still achieve the same results. We're also factoring it in, if we have new programming that's happening right now, we're still kind of keeping it in the back of our heads if we were to need to adhere to these rules, how it would affect the new programming that we're creating right now.
Rodney?
We're paying attention to it. Obviously, the rules haven't been put in place yet. They're still going through, that process of identifying what rules are going to be put into place. But I think it's important to educate the creditor of really what's potentially coming down the pike. And, the days of any kind of aggressive collection tactics is long gone. And it's all about compliance and following the rules and taking a less aggressive approach.
I agree. And as we transition to John and Amy, I want to do two things. First, thank you, Nikki and Rodney, for your candid responses to these questions. And I also want to mention to the audience, for those of you who are students of the CFPB's outline of the new rules for debt collection, I would like to just share with this audience that Ontario Systems is embarking on a study to identify the cost of compliance with the new rules. Well, this study that we are focusing on today is the cost of compliance right in the marketplace today as it exists. That outline of new rules creates a whole new bar for all of us, and it'll be interesting as we share those results with the CFPB to see just how it all unfolds. But with that, I'm going to turn this to John and Amy.
Thank you, Rozanne. This is John Bedard. Good afternoon. Rozanne, let me just do a quick sound check. Am I coming through okay for you?
Yes.
You sound really good to me. Yes.
Perfect. Very good. And so, so the next thing that Amy and I are going to talk to you about is how to consider technology as helping us to reduce cost and also reduce risk. We saw, that the results of this study have a correlation, for example, between training and reduced complaints and lawsuits, dedicated compliance personnel, and annual compliance auditing. And so let's talk a little bit first about this correlation between training and these lower lawsuits and compliance. There are a great many delivery systems out there for training, and we heard Rodney and Nikki talk a little bit about that. But the study suggests, or the study indicates, that these participants had initial early training of about 60 hours for their new hires, but that it dropped off in following years to less than 20. And Rozanne shared some stories about how the seasoned collectors, were commenting about how much training they did not get versus what they saw coming in for the new hires. And technology really can help reduce training costs and increase compliance at the same time. And when we talk about delivery systems, new technology is beginning to hit the market, and there's existing technology that we can be using in terms of systems that require agents to log into either a cloud platform or a premise-based platform to complete training on their own. You know, what I'm seeing a lot of, Amy, and you can comment on it in a moment, is training systems that do not require large segments of the collection floor to leave the collection floor in order to get, an hour of training at a time or 2 hours of training at a time. And instead, I'll almost sort of describe it as trickle training, where it's a constant training process, not necessarily a once a year kind of a thing. And the systems some are integrated into collection platforms, other are separate but delivered next to the collection platform. And there are a variety of different communication methods to deliver it as well. Either, I've heard of, I've not actually seen in action myself, but training programs delivered through internal email systems, training delivered through even the phone, but mostly web-based and mostly or cloud-based. But there are different methods of delivery that can be more efficient and sometimes even more powerful than removing folks from your collection floor, which saves a lot of money and can be efficient. When we talk about the technology applications, one of the other benefits of using some kind of training platform or technology is that we can really begin to deliver what I'll describe as this role-specific training, because all employees may not need all training that the company provides. And so technology can really help you focus training content by role in the company, so that when, like Rozanne mentioned earlier, even executives can get the kind of training that executives need on their roles and responsibilities at the company, which is very different than the training that frontline collectors or floor managers might receive. And so technology can really be allowed training to be delivered in a lot more surgical way, I guess I'll describe it. In terms of using technology platforms for training on a needs base, I really think, and I have seen in the marketplace, technologies that can learn the weakness of its participants. And so when we talk about needs-based training, the training systems can actually deliver content and deliver the kind of content that participants need most. And so we might learn that one particular agent on the floor needs some more focused training on third-party disclosure requirements, whereas other folks on the floor or other executives might need a different kind of training, and that the system will learn the need of the participant and deliver content based on need to take that participant through a curriculum of learning over time. It's not just sit in the room for an hour, check the box, sign the intake sheet, and you're done after 2 hours. It's more of a curriculum-based, ongoing training. Amy, Are those the things that you're seeing today in the marketplace, or are you seeing some different things in the marketplace today in terms of using technology to train folks?
Thanks, John. I'm seeing a lot of different things, and I'd like to applaud the creativity of the people that I've seen do various things from the perspective of determining what the needs for training are, including things like contests and more creative things, as well as your typical, I'm listening to an account rep's telephone calls and conversations, or I'm scoring their responses to the consumer on the telephone. Those are fairly typical, and quality, they arise from your quality department, but also having the fun things that help identify who are your superstars, who are your maybe folks that may need some training, and identifying the needs can come across from maybe a low tech to some of the things you were alluding to, John, is more of a machine learning to determine from speech analytics or what have you what the needs are. I think there's a wide continuum of that. And when it comes to delivery too, I like the small bite-sized chunks that can be delivered maybe in a browser next to the collection platform, so then you don't have to have a specific collection platform, but have that those training delivery mechanisms that are selected via side-by-side kind of thing when they're taking downtime.
Yeah, the other thing that I've seen, Amy, is agencies who incorporate customer experience or consumer experience data into their training program as well, so that they can learn more about the kind of training that folks that are on the phone might need. The last item on this slide here is the progress and tracking, and I think we would be remiss not to discuss just briefly sort of a compensation aspect of the training. When you use technology to deliver training content, there is another sort of benefit you can leverage, which is the studying of all of the progress and the tracking and the data that results from the quizzing or the exams. And I mean, heck, you might even deliver testing questions by the phone. Maybe the next phone call that the agent picks up is a question from the learning management system that asks them to press 1 or 2 to answer a question. But the idea is tracking all of that information on an employee by employee basis really helps an agency to learn where to focus their compliance resources and their training resources to get the most bang for the buck. With respect to compensation, I think it's easy for a compensation structure to be rowing against the stream in terms of what compliance is trying to achieve when it comes to training, and making sure that compensation structure is consistent with the results that we want from a training program and a compliance program is important, because the best training and the best compliance program in the marketplace today will not yield the kind of results an agency might expect if their compensation program encourages behavior that is antagonistic to the results that you want from your compliance management system or your learning management system. All right, let's go ahead and turn to the next slide here when we talk about this idea of increasing cost and value of contacts. Amy, we know that the CFPB is really focused on the industry calling the right person about the right balance. past experience in the industry has been that we can make a very large number of attempts and a very large number of contacts at relatively low cost per attempt or per contact. We know, however, that the CFPB is considering limitations on those very contacts and attempts. And so what does that mean in terms of leveraging technology, and what is the result of that potential limitation, and which is the reason for this slide here when we talk about the increased value and the increased cost of each one of those contact attempts and each one of those RPCs. And it really comes down to making sure that we have not just better, but the best kind of data and the best data integrity to ensure that we get the most value out of those attempts and out of those RPCs, because if they are going to be limited, that means the cost of getting it wrong is going to be very high, because we're going to be capped out on what we can do if any of these considerations that the CFPB has published actually come to fruition in some iteration. And so when we apply technology, we can say, well, what does that mean? And I mean, agencies are really in the best position to have the most perfect data about the consumer and the collection process. And so when we talk about how we make sure our data is the best it can be, you know, we've called it here the new scrubbing frontier. You know, it is very typical to scrub data when it's placed, you know, scrubbing at placement. It may not be so typical, however, and I see less often in the marketplace scrubbing that same information throughout the life cycle of the account. For example, we might scrub for bankruptcy when it comes in, but we might not regularly scrub that account for bankruptcy while it's in inventory. In order to make sure that we've got, you know, the best data on our accounts, you know, I see a future in which we have lots of new data points in which we are scrubbing for. In fact, you know, I see a future in which we know who's going to answer the phone before we even make the call, or the likelihood that the call is actually even going to be picked up. You say, well, how do we do that? Well, you know, in the future, or even right now, I know some of these things are available. We're going to be able to verify the identity of the person that we think belongs to that cell phone or that telephone number. And so we're not going to hopefully worry about wrong numbers as much as we have in the past, because maybe we can scrub for identity verification. Maybe we can scrub for the actual location of the consumer to make sure they're not in a location that at that moment in time that we place the call that would be inconvenient to the consumer. Maybe we may be able to scrub for data about the likelihood that that phone will be answered, or the last time that that phone was dormant for a long time, because maybe that phone number changed carriers or changed consumers. I think that we are not far, if it doesn't exist today, we are not far from being able to have access to data about the experience of a particular phone number, meaning, you know, does this number get answered when it's called or not? Those kind of things. And I think that when we begin to think about scrubbing data and having the best kind of data during the collection process, not only is that going to have compliance impact, but it's also going to have production impact, in my view. And so when we talk about technology, focusing that technology on data integrity, I think is something that will have, like the slide says here, it will multiply the effectiveness of that collection effort.
I think that's right, John. I think what we're seeing is that as we have fewer numbers of attempts that we can make, there is a higher opportunity cost for the other telephone calls that we're not making. And so, like you said, we'll use the information that we have, not just through, there are data vendors out there who can supply us with skip tracing and scrubbing and even some information about who owns this telephone number at this point in time and how confident are we that this telephone number belongs to whom we think it belongs, doing that at reasonable times throughout the life cycle, doing it in a way that allows that vendor to monitor that ownership or monitor that piece of information for us and alert us when it changes. And so there's a number of ways that we can use technology, and I find it interesting that the CFPB's proposals are kind of a response to the industry's use of technology. Right? We've been using technology in certain ways, and it has resulted in a large number of telephone calls. They object to the large number of telephone calls, either to the right person or to wrong people. I mean, they're objecting to both kinds of volumes of calls, and so our response then is to change the technology or to advance it or to take advantages of new technology to kind of respond back and acknowledge the value of that contact.
And to leverage the technology to achieve both purposes, right? To achieve the collection purpose, but to also achieve what the CFPB perceives as being a consumer protection or consumer-friendly purpose as well. Right. And so let's go ahead to the next slide here, please. When we talk about something that gets me really excited, I know you can hear that in my voice, right? I'm very excited, Amy. But it talks about the business intelligence. When the study here, we've talked about training, we've talked about dedicated compliance personnel and annual compliance auditing, but what kind of tools, how can we use technology to actually give those dedicated compliance personnel and the people who are conducting these annual compliance auditing tools that they can leverage on the information that agencies already have? And so let me give you an example of what I mean. I see a lot of agencies that have an enormous amount of data about consumers and about their own experience collecting accounts from those consumers. In fact, the single largest, most accurate source of data about the collection experience is possessed by the collection industry and agencies. And so I don't see, however, many agencies studying the data that would help them actually drive strategy, studying their own experience on accounts to drive collection strategy. I know that it is the experience of people like Rodney's dad who know how to collect an account, right? But I think we are entering a time, if we have not been there already, in which we might be able to study our own experience, and our own experience tells us what we might not know about how we should drive strategy. If we studied all of the accounts that resulted in a payment in the last 8 months, maybe what we do is we study the proximity of phone calls to those payments, or the proximity or number of letters to those payments, or the balances on those accounts, or the demographics. And maybe we will learn about correlations in our own collection experience, very much like we've learned about correlations between compliance and the things that the study revealed here, which is, training and budgeting and all that kind of thing. And so we describe it here as sort of an unconventional analysis of existing data. I really do believe that there's gold in them, their data hills, and I don't see a lot of agencies studying it in ways that might help them drive strategy. does that make sense, Amy, about how we might be able to use this data differently? Are you seeing folks do that now?
I am, and I think it doesn't have to be a scary thing to the smaller agency that, you know, you don't absolutely have to go out and hire a geeky scientist or, you know, someone who can, you know, really understand deep statistics and that kind of thing to, you know, review the data that's generated from the collection activities and the payments that are received on those accounts. You can start in a simple way and move up to a complex arrangement. Or again, there are people in the industry who will take your data and help you, you know, segment it and to help you score it, not using, you know, data from, not just using data from the industry as a whole, but using your own data to help you score it and determine strategies that will help you get more of the good outcomes and fewer of the maybe poorer outcomes. One line of thinking related to that I was engaged in with some people not too long ago is that the scores that you might have really don't help you minimize necessarily your efforts over much because you have certain required things that you do for your clients or certain things that your policy requires that you do, but it helps you find the accounts that you should work more or find
Absolutely.
the activities that you would add to get those good
Absolutely.
outcomes.
Yep. And so Amy, this is a great segue now into our next section of this call, because if ever there was a reason to actually study the data because what we thought we knew the outcome was going to be actually turned out to be different, it's the next subject here that Rozanne is going to kick us off with, and that is this election and the impact of the election. And I promise all of you on the call today, Rozanne's going to be fantastic.
Thank you, John. I was waiting for you to say something. I wasn't sure what you were going to say, but anyway, thank you very much. Yes, to wrap this up, I know that the future of the CFPB is a huge question for many of our listeners, myself included. It's really quite impossible to predict the future. We do know a few things, however. We do know that as President-elect Trump selects his cabinet, we are going to get a very good feel, if not understanding, for the priorities he is going to set and the people who will set those strategies, in particular with regard to banking, credit, and collection issues. We also know that because it's happening, Elizabeth Warren on the Democrat side is already pitching Congress hard to not abandon the CFPB. You know, that's her baby. She organized it, kind of birthed it, if you will, for President Obama, and she is working hard to make sure really Republicans and Democrats do not abandon the principles, much less the organization of the CFPB, because she believes that consumers will respond very negatively at the next House of Representatives election in 2 years, so in 2018. So we know that is happening right now. How this will play out, it'll be for all of us to learn. We know that filibuster technique is something that the Senate Republicans are already talking about abandoning, so that we do not have the kind of log jams and the ability of parties to obstruct the others. We also know a couple of other things that I'd like to close with. I mean, I think most of you, if you know me at all, you know that I was very, very involved with advocacy on behalf of the industry in the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, etc. And there was this period of time when ACA in particular was extremely successful in changing legislation to the FDCPA, to the FCRA, and to the HIPAA, the regulation itself, and among other things. And the reason I bring that up is not because of the people it's because of the fact that we had a united House and Senate. So my personal bias here is one thing we do know is that we have 2 years to go to the Hill as an industry to tell our story and to make some changes. If you're ever going to do it, it's going to be in the next 2 years, not 4, not 6, but 2, before that next congressional election, to make some serious amendments to the TCPA, in my opinion, and to the FDCPA. The reason I say that's so important to point your sights at Congress and not the CFPB is because the CFPB is kind of hanging in the balance right now. We're not sure which way it's going to go. But one thing we do know is the FDCPA and the TCPA are on the books. They have been for quite some time, 77 and 91 respectively, and they both need an overhaul. So my comments about the election are: seize the opportunity as an industry. Do not abandon compliance, because we cannot afford negative press. We can only afford positive press, and I think that is a light at the end of the tunnel, regardless of your politics. John, Amy, Rodney, any comments?
No, I would agree with you. Matter of fact, we've got a new congressman in our area. Leon Panetta's son was elected to the position, and we had a long-term. And I would say that Jimmy Panetta, and I know him. I see him at the YMCA and work out with him, and I'm definitely going to reach out to him and make sure that he comes by our office and he understands what our industry is all about.
Thank you, Rodney. John?
Yeah, I wish I knew.
More trickling or
or
anything?
Well, I wish I knew, just like everybody else, exactly what's going to happen. I do believe, however, that this is real opportunity right now for industry that I don't think has existed in the recent past in terms of having a powerful legislative impact. And if we can capitalize on that, now is the time to do it. The winds are blowing in the right direction. We just have to sort of adjust the sails and see if we can, bring it home.
Well, and I'll say this as well. I think, the president-elect was elected because people are tired of, government regulation. It is choking our industry, not just our industry, but it's choking out everything. And so, hopefully this will be an opportunity to right the ship. So, industry, all industries can operate in a sensible manner.
And hopefully data such as the cost of compliance, particularly when it's married to actual dollars per agency for the industry, and the ability of us to come together as an industry will help us make some of these advancements in the next several years. Special thanks to our panelists, Nikki, Rodney. Their bios are going to be included in detail, and the contact information in the PowerPoint that you will receive, or when you actually have to log in to get it. But anyway, the whole point is special thanks to Amy Kennedy and CJ Clingler on the Ontario staff, as well as my friend and colleague John Bedard. Mike Bevel, you've been wonderful to us. Thank you, and you may close the webinar as you see fit.
All right, the last thing that I will say, no, I will. I did that thing that I told you should do, which is I was on mute and talked for a while and then thought, what just happened? So for those of you who are still on the call, if you have questions that we didn't get to, or if you had questions that occurred to you as you were leaving today's webinar, you can email those to editor@insidearm.com, and it will make sure that they are sent to the appropriate responder. I'm not guaranteeing a response, but don't ask, don't get. Please do remember to take that survey at the end of today's webinar. We use the information in there to make these better if we can. I think we can, and we can do it with your help. And then as Rozanne said, I think we have done it together as a family, and I enjoyed it very much. It is Thursday, November 17th, 2016. You can now safely disconnect from our webinar. You princes of Maine, you kings of New England.